We're going to start on time. We'll shame the people who come in late. So today we have one of our own, Claudia Avellaneda, and her co-author, Gabriel Pina, is right here as well. So Claudia will have 5 minutes as usual. I will keep track, so if you want to get on the queue, just raise your hand if you have a question on point. Also, Claudia just became a U.S. citizen a couple weeks ago, so that's very nice.
So I'm going to start the talk by saying, my fellow Americans.
Just in time, Claudia.
So, there you go.
Good timing.
Take it away.
You have no idea the satisfaction. Even in my school SPIA, they had a surprise party for the three of us that just got a citizenship. So it has been a very nice experience. So this is a project that is co-authored with one of my PhD students, Gabriel Pina. Since I came to IU, I have been extremely fortunate about recruiting students from Latin America. So far, I have 7 students, and with each one of them, I'm working on a different country in Latin America. So it has been really all his effort in terms of data collection. And by the way, he's on the job market, so if you need a very hardworking and competitive student, please, he's the right one to hire, okay? So what is the motivation of my study? So in Latin America, most of the countries tend to be unitary instead of being federal governments. So given that, since the 90s, most of the countries started adopting decentralization. This is like a new version of federalism, not done through the constitution, but just to passing a law. So this decentralization has allowed governments actually gave municipalities a lot of power in terms of decision making. So now the municipalities are in charge of obtaining revenues and planning, funding, and implementing most of the projects. Before, they were not allowed to do that. Everything was data from the central government. Even the governors and the mayors were not elected, but they were appointed by the president or by the respective government. So since then, they have acquired fiscal and political and administrative decentralization and more autonomy. However, despite all these units have achieved a lot of discretion, we see that there is a lot of variation in terms of their performance. So that is what I studied in most of Latin American countries. Why certain municipalities performed higher than other municipalities. And I have assessed that through many different policy areas and through many dimensions of performance. In this particular paper, what I want to assess is variation municipal performance in terms of effectiveness in collecting more revenues. This is a key thing for all the municipalities if we want them to become more autonomous. We don't want them to depend on central government transfers, although all of them depend on that. But if they achieve more independent funds, it means that they can deliver more resources or just do other things. So what explains municipal effectiveness in terms of revenue expansion? There are many factors. The literature has suggested many factors to explain municipal performance or government effectiveness. But in this particular paper, we want to test is what is the role of organizational capacity, particularly what is municipal capacity. And we have seen a lot of studies that have done this in the past. But those studies have relied more on subjective measures and asking and interviewing people. Do you think that you have the right capacities in order to do this? Of course, everyone is going to say yes, yes. So we wanted to test this in more objective terms. So that is the key goal. So administrative capacity, this term has been used interchangeably. For some, it could be used as in terms of capability. For others, have been used in terms of competence. So we want to use these 3 dimensions of capacity as resource, as capability, as a competence, and to measure these 3 different concepts in objective terms. So, and where are we going to test this? So we are testing this in the case of Chile. Why Chile? Gabriel is from Chile. I wish I would have a more justifiable reason, but also Chile has wonderful data sets. Chile is the leading country in Latin America in terms of collecting data. So we found all these data set online. What the interviews that we did was just to verify certain information and to learn more about the causal mechanisms that were into the approval process. So Chile has 70 million population, 345 municipalities. We included 340. The 5 municipalities that were excluded are the municipalities, the richest one, that they don't need to apply for grants because they have too much money. So we are dealing now with 340 municipalities. 15 regions, they don't call it states, by regions, and they cover the 345 municipalities. So this is the data set that we compile from all these municipalities, and what is the process of the grant approval. There's just 1 minute before everyone to understand. The grant approval for external funding implies 3 different processes. This is the pre-negotiation process. So the mayor says, okay, this year I'm gonna apply for 10 grants. So the mayor goes to the governor's office and says, I have 10 grants. So the governors and the regional level says, Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, but I think that based on what you are giving me, only 7 of these grants might make it. So the mayor goes back and tells all his employees or her employees, we are gonna award just on these 7 ones. So this is the pre-negotiation process. We are not starting this because it was related with political issues. So when the mayor has this pre-approval, finally he applies for these 7 applications. And this is done at the national level. And this is what it is required for them to have cost-benefit analysis in order to apply. And then the national government gives them a response, and then the mayor has to implement those grants. But that is done in the private sector. So we don't study this. We are just studying this part of the grant approval. What it takes to send it to the national level. And so we measure effectiveness of grant approvals in 2 ways. One, the percentage of grants that were approved out of the total grants. And the other one is effectiveness in monetary terms. Out of the total amount that was requested, what was the percentage that actually was awarded? So we see that all the 3 measures of organizational capacity matter for municipal effectiveness for grant approvals. Capacity in terms of resources, capacity in terms of capability, and capacity in terms of competence. Okay, that is. So let's start.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll start the queue. So please raise your hand. So Nikos is already on. Go ahead.
So this is more of a methodological question. So in your second dependent variable, the effectiveness in terms of financial capacity, so money requested over money received, how do you treat the proposals that were unsuccessful with respect to that dependent variable? Do they get a 0? Because if, let's say, you ask for 100, you got 0, what happens with those? Do you drop them out of the sample?
We just added the total amount of money that was granted.
But some proposals, do all proposals get funded? Or some?
If you didn't get it, it's 0.
Okay, so my suggestion there would be that perhaps you want to move to sort of a hurdle model, so that, like a Heckman model, where the first stage is whether the proposal was funded or not, and then the second stage is what is the ratio that was funded from them, given the amount of money requested.
Okay.
Right? Because I think that way you are essentially inflating with a bunch of zeros your model because some proposals were not funded.
So actually that will work against our current results because probably we are inflated the zeros now.
I mean, could see. So you're saying you're concerned that so there might be a bias in the estimate, right? Yeah. So, and my other sort of minor concern a little bit is you're adding the average cost on the right-hand side, and I assume the average cost is a component of the amount of money you request.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you're sort of introducing a bit of an endogeneity there, right? Because something on the right-hand side directly is a component of your dependent variable. So I was thinking a way to work around that would be to just work with the total amount requested as opposed to the ratio and just run a quantile regression, right? And see what happens for those proposals that are in the middle, in the median or in the 25th percentile. Because I think it's, and you sort of discuss that in your conclusions, right? You say that the average cost appears to have a negative impact on effectiveness. So I wonder if the more expensive proposals are less likely to be funded because they are perceived as too complicated. So you might get some additional traction just by looking at total amount requested as opposed to a ratio. just an idea.
And what about we didn't control for the total amounts of grants requested? I guess we did it, excluding that independent variable, that control variable.
Well, that's similar to the total cost,
Total costs.
the average cost.
That could be, but any good suggestion? Yeah, the quantile regressions, that could be, so creating a range of values.
Exactly, you can see what happens at the different quantiles for the, depending on the cost, and that can sort of help you, that might help you better identify how the total cost affects, is driven by the different administrative variables you're interested in.
Okay, thank you, Nikos.
Okay, next we have Gustavo, who is always here with us, and he comes from Argentina, where the bureaucratic efficiency is well known. So here he has two questions for you. First, endogeneity issues. I know that it is very complicated to obtain exogenous variations of your key independent variables, but maybe it is possible to exploit some government training program to estimate the effect of expertise on the probability of getting a grant. That's the first one. And then question two, for a future project, what about cost-benefit analysis? Specifically, given your estimations, is it a good idea, that it is cost-effective, to hire an extra employee to work full-time in writing proposals? Similarly, is it a good idea to invest in training personnel or improving the connections with the regional, central government?
Gustavo, wonderful questions. And so the first one about using the amount of money invested in training programs, that would be excellent. And I don't know if it is possible to obtain the data, because that would show, okay, how much the municipality is willing to invest in the training employees in order to do that. One thing that we wanted to see, whether those employees writing grants were part-timers or were long tenured people. But unfortunately, that information is not available for all the municipalities, because that would be a good way to do that. And for future projects, yeah, definitely that is an excellent idea to do cost-benefit analysis. What is actually more profitable for the municipality? To hire full-time employees versus something, or just to contract out an agency to write grants for them. That is the case actually in El Salvador, that I have done research over there. So what the mayors have told me over there is, 3 people approach the mayor and says, Mr. Mayor, I will write the grant for you. What is exactly what you need? So the mayor says, I need the money to install toilets. I will write the grant for you. And if you get the grant, you will pay me back with 50% of the total amount of the grant. 50. And so the other one comes and says, I will write also the grant for you. You will give me 18%. And the other one says, I will come and you will give me 10%. So the mayor hires the 3 of them, and then the mayor selects the one that is asking for the lowest amount. But then the person that does all the lobby is the one writing the grant, because they are the ones more interested in getting the grant approved, not the mayor. So that is in other contexts what I have said.
One other point from Gustavo, he says he feels sorry for the Falcons. And next we have Ken and Michael.
Well, I thought I had something profound to offer, but after listening to Nikos, I feel sort of not very qualified. That was great observations. My observations have more to do with definitions. And when I was reading your abstract, which of course is what you start with, I had all these notes about what equals what. What is organizational capacity? Is well-functioning government the same thing as organizational capacity and government performance, and so on. And as I was looking at this, there were 2 things that occurred to me. One is a broad observation, and another specific to this. The broader observation is, in many fields that we work in, this issue of definitions is critical. And it's amazing how often academics end up either working with vague definitions, because it's really heavy lifting to get a precise definition, or talking past each other because they either have different words for the same concept, or they're using the same word in different ways. And so it's really important. In my work on sustainability, this becomes extremely important. So I was struck by the parallel and how much fun it is in the workshop to see somebody in a completely different field struggling with the same general issue. So that's my observation.
Okay.
My comment is, of course, that I was so pleased. As I was reading this, I'm thinking, boy, she has got to get to the definitions. And then, of course, half the paper is focusing on that. But I had this feeling that you sort of circled that issue, but you never closed in for the kill shot, which was, this is what each one means. And there was one of them where you actually said, competency refers to the ability to do something well. And you started to close in on that one. But on the other two, I kept waiting not for a discussion about definitions, but your definition. What does this mean? And I think that the paper would be clearer if you actually closed that, and said, this is how we're going to define it. I thought the background discussion was fantastic. I kept waiting for your commitment to a particular definition.
Yeah, thank you very much for the point. Again, I suffer from this terrible problem that I write papers and then I don't want to read them because I am afraid about seeing how terrible the papers are. And so this morning I was reading very early the paper and I was just saying, exactly, so what? So what is my definition of these terms? They have been used interchangeably, but what is exactly our definition? So yeah, I needed to take more responsibility and to say, this is the way that I'm going to define it. And usually when I review papers, this is the main criticism that I say, so what is the departing definition so the reader can know how to assess that? Thank you very much.
Kerry Curtilla has an interesting comment. He says, a word is defined the way you define it. By definition. And I think oftentimes we're aware of all of the ambiguity around us.
Yes.
And we hesitate to go, here, this is how I'm defining it. And so consider my comment then validation of your read this morning.
Thank you.
Federica.
Okay, thanks. I guess throughout the paper I was wondering about the political economy of this whole system, right? And so my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that the grants that you're specifically looking at are grants for infrastructure, right? So the likelihood, or it's hard to put this question, but let's say that the possibility that infrastructure grants would be pork grants, right, brings the whole kind of like a political economy and the relationship between the national and municipal government into play. And you seem to circle that problem, again, when you look at the politics variables, and you mention alignment between political parties. But I wonder, can you say a little bit more about the how the politics kind of makes this stories slightly more complicated? This is not a world, I would assume. I'm from Italy. It's not like it doesn't work that the central government gives you money and you get the money and then fund the project, and the project is great. So especially in light of a lack of measurement that you mentioned at the end of the paper for implementation, can you speak more to the political economy aspects and how these relationships between different levels of government may affect the results?
Yeah. No, that is an excellent point, and actually, and the way here I was talking to Gabriel about it, that where we should see more political factors having an impact is in the pre-negotiation process. Unfortunately, we are not that working on that in our paper. Before we had a regression where we were studying all the factors that influence the number of total applications. But then we decided to frame the paper into effectiveness. Because why? The fact that you apply, it doesn't mean whether actually you are capable or have ability to achieve them. So the wonderful thing would be, in order to take into account all the political economy, if we could have all the original grants that the mayor has when they go to the regional office to start the pre-negotiation process.
Right.
That would be the wonderful ones for us to have. But unfortunately, that data is not available. Because here is where we see the party alignment matters a lot. Whether the mayor belongs to the same political party of the prefecto in this case. That seems to have a lot. And also, in the region level, what we see is representation from certain municipalities, councillors. So those people also might have an influence and saying, we are going to support more the ones coming from our municipality. So that would be probably another paper, but you are right. And probably also in the implementation process, we have a lot of more political issues, but that is something that we needed to work. And the problem with implementation that we wanted to do it is sometimes the mayor that submitted the application, the grant, is not the one implementing it.
Right.
Because they are in power only 4 years. And if the guy is not reelected, someone else is going to reelect it. Is going to be elected. In addition to that, they contract out with a private agency for the implementation. So it's more complicated because in that way we need to look at more private and public relationships, something like that. But very interesting.
I'm just going to follow up with one quick question. Who appoints mayors in Chile?
They are elected.
Oh, they're like from below.
From below.
Okay.
And the electoral rolls allow for them to be elected indefinitely, so they can run as many times as they want,
great.
which is not the case in other countries in Latin America. And I found that is the key variable explaining municipal performance. In those municipalities where the mayor is elected indefinitely, they tend to do better job than in those where they are elected only for one consecutive term. Because after the second term, I see that the performance goes down. They don't have any more motivations to perform well because they know that they can't be reelected unless they have political ambition in other levels of government.
I want to follow up this and we'll jump back on the queue because I kind of thought that this political economy issue, as Federica describes it, was missing here for a couple reasons. It was not clear whether it was good to get more grants or not. I mean, is this what's the driving force? Are they all inefficient projects? Are they not? How can you tell? And a way to get at that, maybe to think about the underlying model that would drive your hypotheses. It wasn't clear to me what it was. I mean, there's one model is you're just trying to maximize the number of grants you get in dollars, and that's likely to depend on how the grants are given out, which isn't really described. What do you have to do to get a grant? And so you might design, you can imagine the mayors designing their office to just get the grants regardless of whether, do the roads or the water, whatever the project is, are these efficiency enhancing or not? So that wasn't, there could be a efficiency model that leads to some implications. There could be a maximized grant model that will lead to some different ones, and you could even potentially confront those. So that, I think, is something you could work on more. And it's linked, I think, Federica's, what's the process by which these things get generated.
Good point. I think that probably we need to describe more what are the criteria used in order to award a grant. However, all these grants are for infrastructure, but infrastructure might cover many policy areas. Infrastructure in education, infrastructure in justice to create like a new court, infrastructure in sports to build a basketball court or something like that. So, and even the central government requires that all the municipalities have to invest at least 2% of the total budgets into these three policy areas: education, justice, and sports. So that's why we controlled for those grants that are targeting any of these three policy areas, because we assume that these grants are gonna probably have higher ranking in the criteria that they have to be awarded.
Let me just go a little further. I mean, one possibility is you could break up the grants into types of grants: road grants, sports grants, education grants, because there's no demand here. I mean, there may be the cities are all kind of treated the same, and some may not have a demand for roads compared to others, and some may have more of a demand for education. You might be able to get at that here. There's no sort of demand for government here. That kind of depends on the city or maybe even the region. So I mean, that may be a way you could really potentially break that grant data down into types of grants and really get at. And you may find some real differences.
Yeah.
Road grants may be the pork barrel ones, and education may not be, or what have you. So, but we have Michael next, and then Bernie.
I used to study the Soviet economy, right? And there, the standard thing for enterprise managers was to ask for a lot, right? Hoping to get something. So I'm not sure that the indicator of the share of what they've gotten really reflects what you wanted to reflect, because I don't know how it works in Chile. But again, the standard operating procedure was ask for twice as much, maybe you would get half of that. So it was the share that you receive is not necessarily an indicator of success. It is an indicator of how you're playing the game.
Okay.
Right? So that's one. The second thing is, it might be a good idea to look into spatial lags here, especially because of that earthquake thing. Now I understand that you have the time-fixed effects, and that helps a little bit. But the areas nearby, say, so there was an earthquake, and it was more damaging in some areas, less damaging in other areas, but the municipalities that are next to each other, all right, their demand at least would likely be correlated, all right? And that would introduce a problem if you don't include spatial lags. And it's fairly easy to do. Well, nowadays at least it's fairly easy. Even I could figure out how to do it. So it might be a good idea to look at that. And speaking of the earthquake, I was not really convinced by your argument why the coefficient was negative there. You, I think, had like one sentence saying that the manager were overwhelmed by the amount of destruction. So what? I mean, that should make it easier to put together a good grant. So I would look into it. It might be actually, if you do the spatial stuff, it would eliminate that negative sign. So to me, it was worrisome. So do you see what I'm talking about?
Yes, yes.
With the dummy variable on earthquake area, it had a negative sign in terms of the likelihood of getting the grant, while I would think it would have a positive sign, obviously. So and then a minor thing, or a relatively minor thing, well, two minor things. So first of all, you run system GMM. Usually when people run it, they should indicate the number of instruments and the number of groups. It should not be a big problem for you because you have lots and lots of municipalities. It's just a standard thing because in system GMM you should not have instrument proliferation. So you should indicate that there are relatively few instruments, all right, relative to the number of municipalities, and also that auto-regression of second order is not a problem. I don't know which procedure you are using. I usually use Extabon 2, and that thing indicates those things.
Okay.
It's not shown. It's a minor, it's a technical thing. It's just, I think it's a good idea. And finally, so you do everything on fixed effects, and that's great. But I don't know why a lot of people tend to ignore between effects. I mean, it's true that there are problems with between effects, but why ignore all that information? Because fixed effects presumably sort of eat up, hide the differences, a lot of differences between municipalities, so including the differences that are related to their abilities of getting grants. So you have a lot of controls. See, maybe say the differences in the number of people or capacity or all that between municipalities show up. And again, I understand that it creates problems also, but because you are doing fixed effects, you are already sort of looking at one side of this issue. So look at the between effects too. And there is also this thing called within between effects, that basically it shows both of them at the same time.
Oh, Michael, you raise excellent points, and probably I am biased toward fixed effect because in SPIA, with all the economists that we have there, every time that I present something that doesn't have fixed effects, why you didn't do fixed effect? It's the most conservative estimation, you should do it. And also, in Latin America, for me to get a large data sets, this is a luxury. And this is for the first time that I have 3 mayoral administrations. Hello, I have data from 2005 to 2013, which is amazing. So that's why probably I wanted to use fixed effect.
Sure.
But what you said, between effects, it depends on the kind of question that I want to answer.
Sure, yeah.
Probably I want to say, what makes municipalities more likely to achieve grants? That would be like a more broad question. Yeah, broader question, much broader questions to say but actually you gave me the idea in another paper. And for the analysis of the Arellano and Bond estimation, actually I used the Sargent test to analyze model specification, and it passed the test. And I also found that there was a autocorrelation, first order autocorrelation, but not a second order autocorrelation.
Okay, so indicate that.
Exactly. Okay, I need to indicate that. Yeah, thank you. Gabriel, please take notes. Thank you, Mike.
I'm fine.
You're fine.
People have asked my questions. I've had a couple people ask me.
Then Ken, and then Q's kind of open.
This is virtually a follow-up on Michael's first question, and maybe even an opportunity for yet another paper, which is this issue of effectiveness. You defined it very clearly. It is percent of grants received, one measure, a second measure, percent of money requested that was received. And like Michael, I had this sort of sense of, well, what if your goal is something else and you use the scattergun approach? I'm going to throw just a bunch of crap into this process, and it won't cost me much, but I'll get something back out for no money or for little effort. And so it raises this question, and back to this idea that you've defined what you're doing. So technically, you're great. You said we're defining effectiveness to be percent of grants received. But it opens up other measures of effectiveness. Maybe real effectiveness is how much money we get per citizen, right? Yeah. And so, because you're doing the percent, I think, to in some sense normalize across municipalities. What percent are they receiving? Then big ones, little ones, you're using the same measure. It doesn't have to be different. But what if it was dollars per citizen? And that removes the process, the strategy because ultimately the real goal is dollars per person. And that could be And then it occurred to me, well, actually, even that's not necessarily the real goal. Maybe it's return on investment. So dollars per tax paid to the municipality. Okay, so the city receives $100 million in tax revenue. They get 10 million out of the national. That's a 10% return, or they're getting a 10% subsidy. And that might be true effectiveness.
Okay.
But then the real next paper comes from saying neither one of those is really the goal. The real goal is to provide good services, right? To provide excellent municipal services. And the question is there another measure of effectiveness that you can use? It would probably be some sort of a compound measure on quality of environment or quality of infrastructure or something to that effect. And then you have the same explanatory variables, but now you're moving more toward an outcome-based measure of effectiveness. And again, small or big, you're controlling because the real measure is how good are the roads, how good are the schools, and so on.
No, excellent suggestions, Ken. And actually, the main variable that I have used for effectiveness across other countries has been tax collection per person. That is what I have used. That actually my dean got mad one day that I was presenting. Claudia, who told you that getting more taxes is good? Probably he's conservative. Said, I am not saying that getting more taxes just out of the amount of taxes that you are supposed to collect. What is actually the amount that you are collecting? So that is what I have done in most of the Latin American countries, is tax collection. But in Central American countries, effectiveness has been in delivering electricity and delivering running water. So the way that I have done it is by the total amount of villages that you have at the beginning of your administration. By the end of your administration, how many villages were able to obtain electricity or running water. So I have done it also across. And in the case of Colombia and Brazil, I have done it with effectiveness in education coverage. From the total amount of pupils eligible to receive education, actually how many are registered to receive education. But just in this case, because the data set was so beautiful that there was so disinformation, thanks to God I didn't have to do that work, thanks to Gabriel. So, because imagine to read all these 56,000 grants in order to detect how many people who was admitting the grant and to collect all this data, it was a lot of work. Thank you, Ken.
Michael, did you have?
Yes, I have more.
Go.
Good, Michael.
So first, this sort of follow-up, a virtual follow-up on Ken's, and also on Gustavo's, because I had the same thought that that you're talking about effectiveness, but usually we're more interested in efficiency, namely how far the expenses on these things would go. And one approach, especially now, talking about the quality of public goods and so on. So one approach to doing these things is to do a data envelopment analysis for the factors that it takes to produce. So these things is like expenditures on this, employment and all that. And then after you establish how far the municipality or a region or whatever is from the efficiency frontier, then you could run a regression on some characteristics of that.
Okay.
Region. So just look into this two-step analysis, DEA first, and then regressions. That would be another paper. It's not in this paper. It's another paper. But the other thing, I had a question. I might have missed it or maybe I don't recall now. But I would think the Chilean central government funds some infrastructure without being asked. So it makes so some transfers to municipalities without them necessarily having to apply. So there is a literature that relates transfers to the own revenues collected by the regions, or so maybe the municipalities. It might be that the probability of getting a grant depends on how much the municipality is already getting without having to ask anything. So you may want to look into that.
Excellent point, Michael. This is a standard. Every municipality receives 40% of the budget from central transfers. And
40% of what
40%
budget?
of the total budget.
No, on average.
In average is 40.
Yeah, the average municipality receives 40%.
40%.
Of the
Average, I understand, but how? So if I'm not sure I understand this. So say it again. Every municipality receives 40% of what budget?
Is in average, taking into account a municipality budget, 60% comes mainly from these grants, and 40% they rely on central transfers.
There's no
I
local
understand.
taxation?
No, 60% comes from own sources.
Own sources.
40%, which is similar to the US, and 40% comes from a big amount of money that they put together from the taxes, and they send it back to the
I
municipality.
understand that this is on average. The question I have is how this 40% is distributed, and see, in the US, right, different states would get different amounts from the federal government. And sometimes those amounts would depend on their own resources of the states. And that clearly creates incentives of one kind or another for regional governments or state governments in the US. I actually have done some work on that. So there is literature in general on the incentives created by intergovernmental fiscal or transfer relations. And I did not see any sort of indicator of that here. I don't know how relevant it is to municipalities because Chile is a unitary country, it's not a federation and all that. But if the central transfers are not just strictly done by, say, formula, per capita, so as long as there is discretion there, it might affect.
Yeah, definitely. So
Your
we need to
results.
look more into that, how these transfers probably might play a role in
Yeah,
the
because the
criteria
central
in the
government
decision.
already is giving a lot to this particular
Yeah.
municipality. It may think, all right, we are not going to fund these grants. Or
They
grant
use a
applications.
redistribution formula. So they redistribute from the richest ones to the poorest one. But still, they might have taken that into account in the decision
Yeah.
So
criteria.
a preliminary question might be, what percentage of that 40% actually comes through these programs?
Are you on the queue, Ken?
No, this is this thing that you taught us. You didn't see me doing this.
Yeah, I missed that, yeah.
So just, what percentage is this of total national transfers would be a
Good point.
good preliminary question.
Bill?
This was sparked by an earlier question that Ken asked. Do the municipalities have to submit follow-up reports to the regional or central governments? If so, is there a potential source of data there? We can all easily imagine all of the ways in which such reports might be padded or inaccurate or so forth. but then you just have to ask yourself the question whether a lousy indicator is better than none. But on this question of effectiveness and did the projects actually get built and did the services actually get provided, since Chile is pretty good at keeping data, can you get data like that?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we're talking about that before.
Be a first step in the direction of trying to get at that question of then what happened after the grant was awarded.
Thank you.
On point?
No.
You can come, yeah, so I have a question or two and then Nico's. So I've been seeing a few things that seem to be popping up and I've been kind of thinking about them myself. One, people have been questioning about the dependent variable, and I think at the very least you need to explain why you chose this and not just take it as self-evident that this is sort of what we should look at. And there are lots of different things that people have pointed out here. I'm thinking about that more. I'm convincing myself here, sitting here, that you should break this down into type of infrastructure more and more, because then you'll have something more precise. You know, is this road infrastructure? Is this transportation? Is it water quality, electric? You know, all that stuff. That would be much more meaningful, because then you get very specific sort of supply and demand shifters in your control variables, so to speak. And then, you know, maybe you get some good measurement, number of people serviced by electricity or something like this. You can sort out maybe some particular sectors are more porkish than others. I don't know what that would be. You can link to, you know, is there a federal road budget? So that would be important for the road grants, but maybe not for the school. I mean, I think that would be a way to really to get a lot more, because the big question here is how does the structure of government affect the behavior of government, right? That's the big question. I think that maybe kind of got lost here. I mean, going back to Gustavo's questions also about endogeneity, I mean, to me it seems like this is maybe a simultaneous, I think you have potentially a simultaneous thing going on here, where the outcomes of the government is affected by the structure of the government and vice versa. And so I think you want to think more carefully about how to identify stuff here. I think that's a question that people are thinking about in different ways. The other thing was, you've got these different measures of the bureaucracy here, and you're treating them as though they're independent X's. It's not clear that that's, I mean, they may go together in certain ways, that you have expertise and, I can't remember all of your different ways, but in other words, certain types of municipalities may go together if you're in a 50,000 population town, and if you're in a bigger town or more rural, more, you know, you're in the south where the climate's different. You may have there may be reasons to have a different mix of X's, and so you might even want to look at the, you know, I'm not sure what it's suggesting here. One is, can you explain the mix of X's, and then how do you go about treating it carefully as exogenous here? So those are, I mean, I think those are things to maybe think about here. The other thing is just a more general thing. Maybe you can exploit this earthquake thing more. I mean, that's the real exogenous thing going on here. Maybe there's an earthquake paper.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what it would be, but you know, that's an event maybe you could take more advantage of. So those are my things, and then if you want to respond, Nikos will be the next one, and then there's others.
Yeah, the suggestion about the earthquake paper, that is great, and we had considered that, like, how long does the effect of the earthquake, how long does it last, and affecting, because they were getting different grants in order to recover from this, so that's why we are controlling for them. They were receiving external money in order to recover.
I mean, you might even look, one outcome that wasn't considered is sort of GDP, or per capita income, so to speak. I mean, there's some research out there now on municipal fires back in the 19th century when cities burned up, and in some ways these could be considered good things. You kind of scrape so an earthquake might clean out the bad institutions, you get revitalized, you get organized in a more efficient way. That's one potential thing. So there's a little literature on catastrophic events, if you will, that you might link into an earthquake.
Definitely. That would be another paper, definitely. Yeah.
We have a stack.
Exactly.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah.
You can can come back and get a whole
So-
workshop next year.
Probably it would be better for me if Gabriel doesn't get a job. In that way, you can continue. It's not true, Gabriel. I want you to get a job.
You can start writing bad letters for him. And that'll Nikos.
So this whole discussion makes me think that this is a very complicated issue you're trying to sort of analyze, and it's, as many have mentioned already, the broader issue here is what makes an effective municipal government, right? And so there are several aspects that a municipal administration tries to accomplish. You are sort of defining what can be thought of as a ways to a means to an end, right? You need the money to implement the infrastructure that's required to get to the quality of services that Ken mentioned. So I think the reason we're coming up with all those suggestions is sort of reflects the complexity of the underlying research theme you're trying to capture. And I think it might be useful to sort of outline that in the introduction, sort of to set the stage that this is the broader issue here, what makes an effective municipal government. We are going to focus on this specific narrow aspect, sort of to set the stage and to set yourself up for follow-up papers, which there can be many. And Dean mentioned the earthquake. There could be a nice diff in diff sort of paper, like the before and after.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah,
I was thinking that the same thing could be done for a change in government. So you have the municipal elections. How does a change of mayor affect probability of success in grantsmanship? If you have the same mayor being voted for another term, or if you have a new mayor, how does that affect the bureaucracy within the municipality? Does a new mayor bring in his own staff that might be inexperienced, or might he or she keep some of the existing staff, and how does that affect likelihood of success in grantsmanship?
Excellent points, Nikos. And actually, we control for administration year. And what we see is that in the first year of each administration, they are less likely to be successful in getting grants approved, which means that it needs a learning, it's a learning process. In the second and third and fourth year, they are more likely to get grants compared to the first administration year.
The issue is that does the change in administration also mean a change in the bureaucracy? So is it just that the new mayor comes in and keeps all the staff, or does the entire staff change, or does a proportion of the staff change? And I know you mentioned in the paper that you keep track of those that submitted the proposals, which sort of captures that continuity, but I wonder if it might be interesting to capture sort of the turnover of the municipal staff.
Yeah, but thanks for the suggestion also clarifying why effectiveness. Well, in public management, usually we assess performance in terms of outputs, but the outputs not necessarily are gonna lead us to outcomes, But because outcomes sometimes are very difficult to link to outputs, that is what we use. But there are other dimensions of performance. It could be efficiency, how much do you produce with the least, but there is also another dimension of performance that is responsiveness, how much do you provide out of the total things that are in need, that are needed. The other one is in terms of equity. Do we provide the services to the same neighborhoods or to the same villages? Just here, we wanted to emphasize effectiveness because it's something that has not been tested, at least in the developing settings, in an objective way, but subjective. But yeah, we need to do a better job in justifying what that dimension of performance. Thank you.
Other things? Well, I'll jump in. One thing that I thought there may be other ways to measure the sort of the bureaucratic structure of the city that you leave out, and I don't know how much they vary. I'm thinking about is there a city council that has power? Is the mayor weak? Are there statutory constraints in some cities? The thing that strikes me is you've got, and this is my limited knowledge of Chile, but you have coastal cities who are likely to be very different than these cities that are up by the mines. And they may be structured differently in the cities in the south and so on. So at least laying out, this kind of goes to Nico's point, you could lay out sort of what are the general bureaucratic issues out there in the literature and then what you're focusing on here, and sort of justify your focus and say, well, what are you leaving out? And should the reader be concerned that you're not looking at these other potential ways to measure and categorize these municipalities that maybe implicitly you're saying they're not important by what you've done, but maybe you could at least think about it and lay out the groundwork a little more.
Good point. And actually, there is variation in terms of bureaucratic structure. There are certain departments that need to be in place, like the Department of Planning, for example. Those are. But there are other departments that they might create just because of the mayor decides to Department of Women Issues, Department of Recreation Center or something like that. So there is some kind of variation, and probably we could explore that, but I don't know how much. I will have to link that as a causal mechanism for grant approval. And another bureaucratic structure is whether there is unified versus divided government. How many councillors in the legislation actually belongs to the same political party of the mayor? And we actually control for that. We are doing that. Is the guy working in a unified versus divided government? Because the assumption is if you are working in a divided government, you might be more likely to submit grants because they don't want to pass all your budget approvals that you need. But yeah, probably to explore it more, the difference in bureaucratic structure.
Anybody else? You want a couple minutes to wrap up, recant?
No, thank you very much for all your valuable comments. Actually, now I guess that we have more ideas to write more papers. Now we have 3 papers under review with the Chilean data set, but I'm sure that now we are going to have probably 2 or 3 more. Thank you very much. And again, if you want to hire Gabriel, he's at the market.